My name is Jennifer Rossman. I am with George Mason University in the Graduate Studies program, pursuing coursework related to a behavior analyst certification. I'm going to be doing a brief presentation on Dr. Gina Green. Dr. Green has a huge impact in the field of behavior analysis. I want to give an overview of her career, some of her work I have used to frame my project, and I will also give additional resources as she really has some expansive work that is truly applicable to us as BCBA candidates. For this project, I chose Dr. Gina Green because of her expansive and ongoing contributions to the field of behavior analysis. Her career is so varied and impressive, it was hard for me to narrow down my search credentials for our paper. So I chose to find what I think speaks to some of her award-winning research in stimulus control and early intensive behavior intervention. However, as this slide overviews, her career expands well beyond the scope of the literature I outlined in my paper. She is the president of AIBI. She has worked in policymaking and laws funding for ABA services for families. She has worked on the BACB with certification standards. She is also the CEO of APBA. She's authored numerous articles and co-edited books. She is truly an impressive individual who has had such an impact on the field. Again, Dr. Green's research is so expansive and varied. She is a true example of all of the directions you could potentially go with behavior analysis. Most of her more impactful work, and where she truly began her career, was in early intensive behavioral intervention, or EIBI, and stimulus control. She took much of what she learned from Sidman's stimulus equivalence framework and used it in her own work with prompting, stimulus control transfer, delayed cue prompting, and developing symbol word relations. She also did a lot of work in the early intensive behavioral interventions, which she later goes on to really define as far as efficacy and fidelity of the practice. I will link later some of her own work, which I didn't include in my paper, but that I feel like speaks to the key indicators of intervention services. Dr. Green really does have a wealth of research and work in the field of behavior analysis. The studies that I read of hers that I included in my paper and my annotated bibliography detail some methods of stimulus control, including stimulus control transfer, delayed cued responding, stimulus equivalence, and generalization of skills. Much of her research was conducted on learners with ASD and developmental disabilities. While her work expands beyond the exceptional needs population, it was such impressive work that she was awarded an honorary doctorate from Queen's University Belfast. Truly, her work is a special educator or behavioral interventionist goldmine. I know that's not a technical term, but her work is so applicable and directly relevant to the fields of teaching. So, just a brief summary of the work of hers that I found. I tried to be very specific in the work I included in my paper and in my annotated bibliography because she just has such a varied and long list of professional achievements and publications. So I tried to focus on the work that really earned her the honorary doctorate and with a population of individuals that she really began her career working with. I found 3 articles that are publications of research Green has done in the field. One of the articles, her and her colleague really proved the efficacy of EIBI by performing a 3-year intensive treatment plan on a young child considered at risk for developing autism. Under this treatment, the child was able to perform academically and socially on the same developmental level as her peers. And I should go back and correct myself, not developing autism, but being diagnosed with it. So under this treatment, the child was able to perform academically and socially on the same developmental level as her peers, which is really impressive. So this was a 3-year study. The second research-based article, Dr. Green and colleagues developed stimulus control techniques to determine the impact stimuli have on skill acquisition and generalization. In this study, they're really able to determine that a lot of these stimulus control methods produce inference and not just rote memorization. The third article, I found Green and colleagues develop a stimulus equivalence method of teaching symbol-dictated words to nonverbal learners with ASD. In the other 2 articles, I found publications where Dr. Green speaks on issues within the behavior analyst field. The first one, she deals with the efficacy of EIBI practices. She essentially responds to critiques of the practice, which is a really great article to read just prior to the first study I mentioned about early intervention, as her study was published just a few years after the response to this critique. The second article I found, Dr. Green overviews the exciting advances in stimulus control. Beyond being an impressive piece of literature, it really helped me in this class to gain a clear understanding of how stimuli impact learning and how essentially, as she explains it, all learning revolves around our ability to discriminate and appropriately respond to stimuli. What would I ask Dr. Green? The question is, what would I not ask Dr. Green? I actually listened to a podcast interview with her, which I'll link on the next slide, where she really dives into a number of professional aspects and talks at length about issues related to behavior analysis. So it was hard for me to come up with questions that had not already been asked and answered within that interview. However, I would be really interested in hearing Dr. Green's take on how to implement quality behavioral interventions in educational fields where this knowledge is so important for day-to-day instruction, but also how do you ensure that it's done with fidelity? Much of Dr. Green's recent work is regarding quality intervention and certification, so I would be really interested in her take on how many ABA principles can be easily applied in the classroom and used by those not seeking certification. My second question would just be to hear her recall a challenging study. She has so many research studies, both experimental and applied, that she has done. I would be really interested in hearing about one that really stretched her personally and professionally. Third, I'm interested in her take on some of the new augmentative alternative communication technologies out there, or AACs, and how it might pertain to some of the work she has done on things such as stimulus equivalency, and in particular her one study where they work on symbol-word relations, and just how she thinks these advancements impact the field going into the future. Last, I would honestly just be really selfish and ask for her advice on some challenges I have faced in the classroom. I can think of one student that I worked with in the past who we believed became really aggressive as a response to pain. So it was a really big challenge to myself and those that were working with him as well as to how to approach some of the aggression that he displayed when he was in pain. And I would just love to know from just such a well-versed individual how she would approach the situation. So here's a list of other resources, and I added this just because though I really tried to find bodies of work from Dr. Green that demonstrated much of her career framing work in things like stimulus control, her work with individuals with ASD, and her work in EIBI. I think it's really important that I just link and acknowledge some of her other more recent work. So this page is essentially just if you're interested in exploring some of her other contributions to the field. Of course, she plays really important roles in APBA and ABAI as well. And so anything going through those websites is really interesting. I linked a podcast with Matt Sicorio where he does a really in-depth and comprehensive interview with Dr. Green. She just talks about a number of relevant topics. She even talks about like how she began her career, which I found really interesting, just her career history. And she discusses time working on the BACB. So she has helped develop some of these credentials that we're currently going through. And she's also done a lot of work with like lawmaking and impacting policymakers as far as funding for individuals with ASD and like getting their therapies. So it's just a really comprehensive podcast, and I just think what better information to get on Dr. Green than to hear it from her herself. The second bullet point, it's just an article that I think is really a good insight from Dr. Green's work. It's kind of like a nice little capstone of her work and her accomplishments. The purpose of the document was actually to give family members or other stakeholders like insight into quality indicators of an ABA treatment program. She kind of talks about how ABA is just such a buzzword lately, and a lot of practitioners will say that they do ABA, and just what exactly that means and what you would want to look for in a quality practice. I also think it's a nice guiding document for myself moving forward if I want to, someday provide some of these services to clients, I would want to make sure that I'm following some of her quality control advice here. And then finally, this last one is just an article that she has published more recently on certification programs for BCBA. Again, it didn't really quite fit into the body of work that I had tried to find, that I felt like kind of framed her career, but it's still just really good information. And so there's a link there. So this is just my reference page. Just to wrap this up, I could keep talking about Dr. Green probably for a long time because there's just so much information on her and her career. But she's definitely been a very impactful figure in the world of behavior analysis. She has and continues to really shape the field as far as her research and her leadership contributions. She's very widely published, highly respected as a professional, and I definitely have really enjoyed researching her. I found it very enlightening and very informative, and it has really helped frame some of my understanding in this course as well.